Hi everyone, welcome again to another SysAid monthly webinar. Well, the holidays are behind us and we're all ready with another year of great content. With the opening of this year, we're issuing another version. It's 14.1. We're in the beta stages right now of this version and you're all going to see it very, very soon. We've decided to discontinue the use of Derby database with this version and we're moving on to use Microsoft SQL. And to tell us all about that is Joseph Zargari. How are you, Joseph?
I'm fine, Michael. Thank you. It's good to be here again.
Great. So our viewers are probably wondering, why did we decide to make this move?
So that's a good question. We've been using Derby ever since SysAid was first introduced over 10 years ago.
Right.
And Derby was a good database, and we used it for many of our customers chose to use that. And over the past few releases we made, and in the upcoming release 14.1, we're coming out with new features and we need to store more data inside the database. So the databases are growing in size and Derby is just not working well enough when the database grows. So it's mainly scalability issues. As the bigger the database get, the slower they perform, the less reliable they are more prone to corruptions. So that's why we're moving to Microsoft SQL.
Great. So let's take a look at today's agenda.
Okay, on our agenda today, we're going to make a short introduction to Microsoft SQL. We're going to see how SysAid interacts with Microsoft SQL, how it connects, and how it even installs Microsoft SQL with the new version. We're going to start getting into Microsoft SQL. We're going to connect and see what we can do with the Management Studio. And we're going to talk about some of the best practices for security, performance, backup, and restore.
If you want to contact us, you can do that either by clicking the chat link below. We have a representative ready for your questions. You can also ask questions on @SysAid Academy #webinar on Twitter and our Facebook page. So let's get down to business. We'll start with the basics. What is Microsoft SQL?
So let's see what Microsoft SQL is all about. So Microsoft SQL is a form of DBMS. It is a relational database management system. What it means is that we can store, it allows us to store data inside tables, and tables can contain different types of columns, and the different types of columns can store different types of data. For example, we can have a column storing dates, for example, date of birth. Okay, so it will store information in form of date. And we can have data types of numbers or strings or different other types of data. And a single database can contain many tables. Last time I checked, SysAid had over 200 tables. So a database doesn't mean just one table with one type of schema. A single database can contain many tables. Talking about Microsoft SQL in particular, right now the most recent version that is out there is SQL Server 2012. That is correct as of January 2014. So if we look at the last few versions we had of Microsoft SQL, we had 2005, 2008, and then there was another edition of 2008 named 2008 R2. Okay, and I do want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to expand a little further about the additions The more, let's say, the more worth mentioning versions are the Enterprise, the Standard, Web, and Express, and they differ between one another in features, capabilities, what type of resources they can utilize from the hardware running on it, and obviously costs. So these are the differences. We're going to have a little bit more information about that in a couple of slides.
Okay, so now we understand what Microsoft SQL is. So I have a question. Before, when we used Derby, we didn't have to worry about configuration. Everything was done for us. What's going to happen now?
Right, so let's take a look at how SysAid interacts with Microsoft SQL now during the installation process. So the way SysAid interacts with Microsoft SQL, the way it connects to the database to store data on it and pull data from it, is using JTDS. JTDS is an open source JDBC driver. Not going to go too deep into the explanation of what JDBC means, but it's just a form of connecting from Java applications to databases. So JTDS is an open source connector, open source driver, and we use that to connect. And during the installation, if you go to install SysAid right now and you want to install SysAid using Microsoft SQL database, today you have two options. If you choose typical on the installation wizard, you will get SysAid to install a fresh copy of Microsoft SQL Express Edition, version 2008 R2, and this will basically put a database server on the same machine where you have SysAid, where you're installing SysAid, and it will create a database inside, and it will connect automatically to that database. Just keep in mind, it will put the Express Edition, and we're going to look at the differences in a minute. But if you already have a Microsoft SQL server in your organization, then the right way to do it is by going to the customized setup type and choosing Microsoft SQL. Then you can point to your already existing SQL server. This way it will not install a local copy of SQL Express on the same machine. It will instead connect to an existing Microsoft SQL server.
So we're done with the part that's related to SysAid and how to connect Microsoft SQL with SysAid. Now, not every organization has a DBA. Can we give our viewers, a few basics on how to even start handling Microsoft SQL?
Right, that's the whole purpose of this webinar.
Yeah.
We want to show you some tips and tricks on how to use Microsoft SQL. So let's continue.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about getting started with Microsoft SQL. I chose to show here a small table with some key additions of Microsoft SQL and some of the differences between them. And let's talk about the more important stuff, which is the capacity of the database that is allowed and the number of resources that it supports. So if you go with the Enterprise Edition, and obviously that's the most expensive one, you get as many CPU cores and as much memory as your hardware has. Okay, and the maximum database size is 524 petabytes. So I would dare to say unlimited, right? 524 petabytes is pretty much unlimited. Standard Edition allows up to 4 sockets or 16 cores, the lesser, and it also supports up to 64 gigabytes of memory. The database size restriction is the same, or let's say unrestricted, the same. And same goes for web. The web edition has similar capabilities. However, there is a difference between standard and web edition in terms of licensing. You would purchase a web edition for running a website if you need a database to run a website off, and standard would mean storing data related to applications in terms of licensing. And we have the Express edition, which is what we're including now in SysAid. If you don't have a database, then we'll install Microsoft SQL Express for you. And it supports up to 1 socket or 4 cores, the lesser. And it will support up to 1 gigabytes of RAM. The database size here, there's a limitation for 10 gigabytes. So you should, if you're going to use the embedded database offered with SysAid, you'll need to consider the database growth. The bigger it gets, the more you'll need to consider switching to a standard edition of Microsoft SQL, or switching, if you already have an SQL server in your organization, you'll need to consider moving the database to a standard edition at least. There's a few more differences. For example, high availability is supported with the Enterprise Edition. You can set up a few SQL servers. They can connect to the same storage, and they can be kind of a cluster of database. So you get high availability, always on kind of features. You also have difference in security, reporting services, and so on. Let's go into SQL Server right now. So before we really switch from the presentation here into the actual tool, just want to mention that Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, that's the application that allows us to manage the server, the SQL Server, and the databases. We don't have to use it. There's command line tools that allow us to do it, but it's so difficult and so unfriendly that I always say that it's a must. The SQL Server Management Studio really is a must. And if it's not included with your SQL Server installation, you can always go to Microsoft's website and download it separately. So I'm going to switch over. I have SQL Server Management Studio open on my computer here. And we're using Michael's computer, so it's installed locally here. And I'm going to log in with the SA account. The SA account is the super administrator account for SQL Server. It has all the permissions, and we'll touch base with that user account at a later time. But let's start by looking at the tree view here. We have the server, or the instance of Microsoft SQL. We've got the database over here. And this is where you would need to create a new database. If you would set up a new application, you can just right-click, New Database, choose the database name, owner, and where the files are stored. We're also going to look into that shortly. And we've got some of the security options here, like the user accounts we have. We have some of the server settings over here. Right-click the root of the tree and go to Properties. We'll get that. But again, we'll get there when we start talking about some best practices for security, performance, and so on.
So we got a very nice introduction to the Management Studio. What can we do with it actually?
So the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio is a tool that allows you to manage the database server, the database themselves, and even run queries. You can update the database or select, show information from the database. It's just worth mentioning that the SysAid end user license agreement doesn't allow customers to make modifications to the database. So we need to make sure we don't make any modifications, any updates to the database itself.
Right. But if there comes a case where we do need to do it, so we have our customer relations team here.
We're here for you.
We're here for you. Okay, let's start talking about best practices with the Microsoft SQL.
Right, so you install Microsoft SQL, it doesn't come out, it comes out with the default settings. It doesn't mean the default settings are the correct and recommended settings. So let's take a look at some of the best practices we here can offer.
Okay.
So let's talk about security best practices. The line here in bold, default settings don't mean recommended settings. This is something we need to remember specifically with systems that store important data. And a database can store some really sensitive data. And the default settings it comes with out of the box when you finish installing Microsoft SQL don't mean they are the recommended settings. Let's review some of the best practices here. Disable unnecessary network protocols. Review what type of network access your applications require and only leave them enabled. And even when you do that, use firewall to prevent connections from unauthorized IP addresses. Just leave the IP addresses of the applications that are really allowed to connect to that database. Furthermore, if you have the SQL Server running on the same application as your application is running on, then you can even disable any network connection on anything other than the local host. For example, let me show you how this can be configured. I'm going to go to the SQL Server Configuration Manager, and over there we can go to the network configuration, and you can see TCP/IP connector is disabled by default, but in our case in SysAid we need the TCP/IP connector, so we'll have to enable that. However, enabling that doesn't mean we need to open that to the entire world. All we really have to allow is connecting from the local host, because everything else SysAid will connect from the same machine. We don't need connection from anywhere else. So I can just disable everything else. There's a few more. I'll have to run each one of them and disable those. And I can even set up a non-default port for using SQL Server. The default is 1433, but I can do let's say 3142, for example. Let's do that. I'm going to copy it, so I'll have it later when we need it. And we need to restart the service. Specified file read only. Let's try this one more time. Oops, sorry. Okay, it did take it this time. Now we need to restart the SysAid, the SQL Server service to apply this change. So I'll go here. We're talking about this instance here, SQL Express, and we can restart the service here. You can also go to the standard services window and restart the service from there. That's also fine. So disable unnecessary network protocols and use firewall to allow connections from authorized IP addresses only. Now, I'm also going to address the authentication. SQL Server comes with two types of authentication. We have Windows authentication, which means in a domain environment, in Active Directory domain environment, it will allow you to authenticate with domain credentials. or if you're not in a domain environment, then local user accounts inside Windows, you can use those to log in to SQL. Or there's also SQL Server Authentication, which means you create local accounts inside SQL, and you can define the password and all that kind of stuff over there. The best practice, the bullet point we have here is talking about those two methods. We recommend using Windows authentication only whenever it's possible. It's more secure and it's easier to manage, and you still have access from the domain to disable the account if you need to. And the way you do that is going to the server configuration, under Properties, Security. You can decide whether if you want to do the mixed mode, SQL Server and Windows Authentication, or you just want to go with Windows Authentication. Before you do that, remember the user I used to log in here was the SA account. It's a local account. If I do that, I disable my ability to use that account to log in. So before I do that, I'm gonna add a new login here. And Michael, I'm gonna use your account. Sorry, I have to choose the domain. And there we go. So this account is a Windows authentication account. So we don't have to manage the password and password policy and nothing like that over here. We need to make sure this user is enabled and is granted to connect to the database engine. And under server roles, I'm also going to grant the sysadmin server role so that we can use that account to make configuration changes. Once we do that, oh, it's already there. How did I miss that? User is already here, so I don't have to add it. All I have to do is just edit that login, make sure it's enabled and granted permission to connect, and that it has the right server role of sysadmin. So once I do that, I can disable the SA login under status, and I can switch over to, yeah, my account is disabled, I can't use it anymore. So we'll need to connect now with Windows Authentication. It will not need my username and password because I'm already logged in to this machine with Michael's account. So we can go in and modify the authentication settings from here. Instead of doing the mixed mode, which is harder to maintain and monitor, we'll go with the Windows authentication mode, which allows more centralized security monitoring. We'll need to restart the service once again to apply, and this means that we no longer allow SQL accounts to log in. Now, another best practice is to use designated user accounts for applications. For example, SysAid needs to connect to the database. Don't give it all the full permissions to the whole database server. All we need, in case of SysAid, we really need just a user that's going to be the owner of the database, and it needs to have the ability to do everything inside that database. SysAid doesn't need any more permissions than that. Doesn't need to manage the server or make changes to the server. Just full permissions to the database itself. So you'll need to use designated accounts and limit the permissions of what they allow. The way we do that, and I'm just going to show this to you with my user account, for example, under security logins, I'm going to create a new login. This time I'm going to use my account. And let me just make sure I don't have server roles. I'm not a sysadmin. It's a public account. It doesn't have permission for anything yet. And if we go to create a new database, we can decide that the owner of this database is Joseph. Oops. Hold on, let's just browse that user. Oh, my username is different. So this is the owner. Okay, we have the owner of the database, and we need to enter the database name, and we'll get back to this screen, so I'll leave that open. But just to address the owner part, this is it. Once we make a user the owner of the database, it has full permissions to make modifications on it, decide on the schema, insert, delete, whatever it needs, it can do. And last recommendation on security is to install updates and service packs regularly. That means you can even use the Windows update on the server to apply patches automatically, and you'll need to make sure they are installed. And SysAid version 14.1, and here's a spoiler alert, it comes with patch management, so you can use that to update patches on your SQL Server.
Great, so that was best practices when it comes to security. What about performance?
Yeah, let's talk about performance. Performance is defined, well, a good performance is defined by what your users expect. That's obvious. Let's think about some of the ways we can increase performance on SQL Server. First of all, we didn't really talk about that, but the SQL Server can be running on different machines than the applications or the users, obviously. And if you use a separate server to host the database than the server running your application, make sure they have close proximity in terms of networking. Make sure they're on the same LAN. This way they get no or very little latency when it comes to connecting from the application to the database. In addition, this is something we didn't mention yet, but maybe it's time to mention. SQL Server stores the data in two files usually. We have one file storing the data, and then a second file storing the transaction logs. The transaction logs is basically any command you send to the database to insert new data. Not only it saves it to the data file, it also saves it to the transaction logs. This way, whenever you make a backup of your database, the transaction logs are getting truncated. When time comes, if something happens and disaster hits, you need to restore your data from backup. You can get the latest backup, which brings you to a certain point in time where you made a full backup of your database. And then if there's some way you can extract the transaction logs somehow from the corrupted server, then you can combine that with the backup and bring you to an up-to-date copy of your data. Because the transaction logs have the new data inserted after the backup was taken, you get an up-to-date copy when you merge the latest backup and the transaction logs. So that's really cool, the way it stores the data. The idea here on performance is, since you have two files and you're writing to two different files, then you're still limited by the performance that the physical disk provides. There's only a certain amount of spins a disk can do. And if you do the two files on two separate physical disks, you can enjoy the speed of two disks combined. I also mentioned here to put the backups on a third disk, on a separate disk, so that when you run a backup, it will not affect the performance on the application. It will not affect performance reading and writing to the data or the transaction logs. Or, you know, it will affect, but it will have less effect over it. And you know, just before we continue to the next bullet, just want to show you how it's done. We have the window here showing the creation of the database. I'm going to name this SysAid, for example. And then we have, I'm going to scroll to the right here, the path where to store that file. So the default put both files into the same directory. So you can choose to put them in different directory or if in different drives. That's the recommendation, to put the files into separate physical disks. Okay, performance demanding systems always get the fastest disks. You know, disks are coming in all types of flavors, I would say. You get the standard disks, you get the faster rotating disks like 10,000 RPMs, 15,000 RPMs. You even have SSD, which is not even spinning disks. It's much, much faster. But obviously the price goes up. Each gigabyte of storage costs a lot more, and you need to consider what your budget allows and just get the fastest disks, because that's the key to high performance on SQL Server. That is usually the bottleneck. Slower disks are usually the bottleneck on database systems. So this is an important thing you need to consider. And that will also affect the IOPS. IOPS is a parameter that you monitor in terms of disk writing. And specifically when we're talking about databases, input-output operations per second means how fast the disks can write. And so this is an important thing you want to monitor. That depends on how fast your disks are. And CPU usage, obviously, that's another piece of bottleneck. You need to look at the CPU usage, see that there is no constant high CPU utilization. That means that either your applications are doing something wrong, or your SQL server is just not strong enough. The hardware is not good enough. So always make sure to monitor those two parameters.
Okay, so we're dealing with backup and restore now. So although the Microsoft SQL comes as an embedded database, the user still needs to backup it. It's the user's responsibility to back up the database. What does it involve?
Yeah, let me show you some of the ways you can back up and restore the database with. So backup could be very simple, and it could be very complicated. There's a lot of backup solutions specifically for Microsoft SQL, starting from the simplest, and I'll show you how to do a quick backup of a SQL database with Microsoft command. And from that you can grow on to sophisticated state-of-the-art backup solutions that have connection to Microsoft SQL and can do things so much more sophisticated. I wouldn't necessarily say better. That really depends on what tools you have and what kind of budget you have to spend on it. But you know, I like the basic backup option. So I'll show you how to do a quick backup in a minute, but let's talk about the best practices. Backups should be done on a daily basis at least. If you want to do backup twice a day, full backup twice a day, that's fine, but make sure to have at least one backup, full backup every day. You want to keep the short-term backups accessible to you. So for example, if you make a backup every day, keep the last 7 days nearby you so that you can always, somebody says I lost some piece of data, you can always go to the backup from the last day or last 2 days, 3 days, 7 days, and quickly restore it and get the data you need. In addition, you want to keep long-term backups off-site. And if possible, you can keep 2 copies of the backup on 2 separate remote sites. This way you have the perfect disaster recovery plan. Nothing can hit your data. If something happens to the database server, you always have 1 copy nearby and 1 or 2 other copies on remote sites. So that's also important to keep. And if you're storing your backups somewhere online, a lot of organizations like to store backups on Amazon, and I think that's a really good option to keep remote backups. You need to consider how much time it takes you to upload and download the backup copies. If you know the backup takes so long to restore, that's why you have the 1 copy nearby on premise, so that whenever you need a quick restoration, you can always go to that. And my last tip here is to practice the data restoration and practice frequently. I like to practice data restoration at least once a month, and whenever I have a spare hour, I always like to go and make sure the data is stored properly. If the backup operation fails, you will not know about it until you actually try to restore it. So that's why it's so important to practice. Let me show you how you can make a quick backup of the database. So going back to the SQL Server Management Studio, and again, you can do this with a command prompt, with a command line, but this is so much easier, so I always prefer showing it this way. Going to right-click the database, go to Tasks, Backup. There's a few things we need to look at here. First of all, choose the database. It's automatically going to be chosen when you right-click it, so that's fine. Backup type, you can choose full or differential. Differential means just the changes since the last full backup. So I'll use full for now. And let's go here. This is where you want to store it. And I'm not sure many of you still have backup tapes, but if you guys do, then there's the option of using backup tape. But I just usually choose disk. I just write to a file, myapp.bak, that's the file we have here. And some of the other options are showing right here. You can overwrite if that's already an existing backup and you want to overwrite it. You can choose overwrite, or you can add an additional backup to the same file. So when you restore from that file, you can choose to what point of time you want to store into. You can review some of the other settings here, but I'll just hit OK and it will do the backup right here. It did that really quickly because that's pretty much an empty database, so it takes a very short time to do that. Restoring is also going from the database, right-click, Tasks, Restore, and Database, and then you need to choose what you want to restore from. So you can choose Device, choose the file that hosts this backup. And when you do that, you'll get the different backup sets from which you can restore from. I only have just one backup for this, so only one to choose from. And then going to options, you can overwrite the existing database. This will basically, if you're doing disaster recovery, you create a new database. So obviously you want to overwrite the existing database. Click OK. It will do the restore, and your database is now restored.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. it's been great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was great being here. If any of the viewers want to connect with me, I'm on Twitter @Joseph Zargari.
Well, great. So we're ready to summarize. That's it for this month. We were speaking about how to work with the SQL database server and how to get started with it. If you want us to speak about the SQL language and how to write queries, tell us about it on Twitter. We're listening to you. If you still want to talk to us, we're still on chat. Just click the link below. You can still ask questions on Twitter @SysAid Academy, #webinar, and of course, contact Joseph on his Twitter. And we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.